So we're learning about the attribute of Malchut, of kingship, of hisnasus, of elevation. And we spoke last week that the attribute of Malchus has in it two components. It's very to one side, it's like a king that's elevated, but at the same time, it's like King David. That King David says, "Tefillah ani," it's humility. So it's the power of the king and the focus of humility, which makes the attribute of Malchus, which is very focused. That's all other attributes are attributes of ideas, wisdom, understanding, in the intellectual attributes, and the emotional ones is kindness, severity. These are all feelings and emotions. But until it comes down to Malchus, Malchus is action. The idea is that there's no king without a nation, and the idea is that just like a king is giving and providing for peoples that are under his rule, so too the idea of Malchus is the communication, going out, interaction. So to feel kind and to want to be kind are all nice. It's acts of kindness, and it's the world of action goes through Malchus. So and it's humble because it has the tools of what it's given. A king is like a king lives off its taxes. So if it's a rich country, the king has what to work with. If it's a poor country, unfortunately, then the king has less to work with. So too, Malchus takes from attributes. If there's a lot of wisdom and understanding and connection and kindness and severity and balance and healthy, so then Malchus has a lot to work with. If there's less, then it has less to work with. But its job is to take everything that it receives. It's not an entity on its own where it has the ability to do. It just has the ability to do with what it's given. And the difference is that it actually does. It does what it has to do. So here he says another idea. So we're trying to understand, how does that mean? What is the idea of Malchus, connecting to God as king, the level of God as king, as the attribute of Malchus? How does that apply to our relationship with Hashem? And also the idea of Tomar Devorah is to understand how this is connected to our relationship between Ben Adam and Chaveri, between peoples, between the husband and wife, etc. So he says, There's another concept about Malchus, kingship, that's very important. Shar ha'avoda kula, which is, he calls it, the gate of absolute avodah, of service. And what does that mean? And this is based on the idea of Yiras Hashem, fear of God. Like you fear a king, the idea of a king is to have Yiras HaMelech, to fear the king. To the attribute. Hey, Beth, the attribute of Malchus should inspire kingship. When we look at God as king, is meant to inspire within the person, he or she, the feeling of fear of God, Yiras Hashem. And this is the ideas that the Alter Rebbe talks about. I mean, sorry, that the Ramak talks about in this section of Tomar Devorah is very much connected for those who study chapter 41 of Tanya. Like it says in the chapter, like it says in the beginning of chapter 41, it says that it starts off saying that Baram Tzarech Liyos the Zichrein Tamid, a person has to remember constantly Reishis Avodah V'Ikra V'Sharsha, the beginning of all service of God, and its root, that is Ki Av Shayir Hisharish the Sur Mirav Avodah Asitoiv, and he goes into that you have to have both fear and love, but you have to, it's not enough to have just love of God. You can't just love God. You must fear God. And a lot of what we're going to learn now over here in a little bit further in the Tomar Devorah are ideas that the Alter Rebbe discusses in chapter 41. Obviously, the Ramak lived before the Alter Rebbe, and I'm sure the Alter Rebbe studied it. We know clearly the Alter Rebbe studied the teachings of the Ramak. So we know the Rebbe also mentioned many times that there are ideas that Tanya, a lot of the ideas of Tanya, and certain things have been taken from the Tomar Devorah. And we see literally a lot of the ideas that we're going to discuss about fear of God are found in chapter 41 of Tanya. It says, there's something else a person has to pay attention. Because what's the something else? We spoke about that a person has to try to emulate God, just like God is a king that's in exile. So too, we learned last week the concept that a person should try to find the idea of exile in their life. In times before, 200-300 years ago, 100 years ago, people used to actually go into exile. Self-inflicted exile, meaning they would leave their home and comfort and the familiar space, and go from city to city. No one knew who they were. And the first thing that we spoke about is the idea of humility. That person shouldn't view themselves as something special, to get your ego in check. So those are the first things we learned from Malchus, from kingship, the humility of the attribute, and the situation that the king is in now, which is in the time of exile. The king is in exile, and therefore a person should try to connect to God's kingship by going through a similar situation, even though we all have plenty of difficulties in our life without going into exile, and we live in Galus and we want the Mashiach to come, but nevertheless, there's actual personal experiences of Galus that was something that some people used to do, and the Ramak promoted it. Okay, the next thing goes Oid, but another idea about kingship that should inspire the person, that's the idea of actually your relationship to the king, not to emulate the king's humility or feel for the king's exile, but to actually understand that God is king. And therefore, when God is king, when you realize that, it should inspire fear of God. And he says, this is Shar HaVoda Kula, this is the gate of all service. Yiras Hashem, to fear God, the great respect for God, the greatness of the king. Like he says, like Alter Rebbe explains in detail in chapter 41, should inspire the person feeling of fear of God. Behine, the Rebbe says the Ramak says like this. Again, you're not supposed to fear God for punishment. When a person recognizes that God is God, and everything that good or bad happens in a person's life, whether it's your view of good or bad that happens in a person's life, is comes from the king. So a person may feel you're scared of what's called yiras ha'inish, fear of punishment. But that's not fear of God. That's not again, like the Rebbe says in Perek Tanya, that's not what yiras Hashem is. That's a very low level of fear, where a person operates and connects to Hashem only because you want God to be good to you. So you want God to give you and bless you. So you don't want to do anything. You don't want to step out of line. That's what's known as a very low level of fear. So he says, "V'hina yira misukenes ma'oid." The pogem likonis bo elachitzonim. He goes, you have to be very careful. Shari'im hu yira min yisurim. That yira, fear, fear. The problem of fear is that fear, if it's just about punishment, so then it's not about Hashem. It means you recognize that God is your God, and therefore, so therefore you're dependent. You feel dependent on God, but that dependency that's based on punishment or reward is very dangerous. He says it's called misukenes. It's very dangerous. Why? Because it's the pogem. If you're only worried about offending, it could be very damaging if the only reason you fear God is because you have fear of Yisurim, that you're going to suffer, or from death, or from hell. So he says, if that's the case, is that it's called Yira Chitzonis. It's an external fear. It's about you. You don't want to have anything bad happen in your life. You only want good things. You say, what does God want from me? What can I do? What's the book? Tell me what I have to do. That God, that everything that happens in my life is good. But it's so self-centered. It's all about you. So therefore, if that's the case, so then he says it's misukenes. It's very dangerous, because then it's that could change, and therefore you let in other things, and your mind could start wondering: is this really something I should be concerned about? Your relationship to God should not be about reward and punishment, like it says in chapter 1 of Ethics of the Father. Shekol pulasi elu min amnam min achitzonius min achitzonium. If it's all your relationship with God is all about external, because you're scared of punishment, not because you have awe of the great king. What's the difference? When you see something great, you want to have a relationship with something great, not because that specifically that great being, in this case Hashem, could reward or punish you, but because this is greatness. What is the main fear of God? The yiras Hashem. You have to analyze 4 things. he's going to break down the fear of Hashem into four categories. Again, all those four categories are discussed in chapter 41 of the Tanya. Harisha, and the first thing that a person should focus on when it comes to fear of God, to recognize God's greatness on everything that exists. Means everything you could look at in the world exists from Hashem. And that's why in those who pay attention to the verbiage, the language of the tefillah, of the prayer, specifically the parts of the prayer we say in the beginning of the prayer, before we get ready for the blessings of the Shema, we describe God's greatness within creation. So when you look at Hakol Nimsa, everything that's in creation, and the greatness of Hashem, like we say, Gadol Hashem Muhul Miyoid, God is great. Bahariya Adam, here he says, he gives an interesting analogy. He says, Bahariya Adam Yar Mina Ari, Umina Doiv, Umina Anas, Umina Eish, Umina Mapilis. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of things that awe a person. And some of them is fear, and some of it is just you're awesomed by it. For instance, he says, a lion. It's not when a person is what is the fascination a person has? Every kid goes to the zoo. Where's the lions? Certain animals get more attention than others. What's so special about the lions? Not just because the lion represents the power, the gvura of a lion. Not because you're scared of the lion. The lion can't touch you. The lion's behind the gate. They're behind the glass. He says a person, he says, has fear. He's not talking about fear like you're scared of the lion. But you're awesome, but you feel an awesome energy around the lion. Or mina doiv, or a bear. Mina anas, right? The concept of a person who an anas actually is a person who's a mafia person. It's another thing. A lot of people are fascinated by the mafia, right? Like a person who's an honest, a person who forces themselves in a person's life. We're not talking about sexually. We're talking about mainly just becoming a tyrant over people. So the concept of it is not a good thing. A lion's not a bad thing. A bear's not a bad thing. But that he's describing things that inspire fear in people or to be awed by, but not because you're specifically scared that person's going to hurt you specifically. It's just the concept of it. Umina eish. Again, another thing, people are fascinated with fire. It's not the fascination. It's not because a person doesn't stay up at night thinking that I'm going to be hurt by fire. Okay, you have a fire alarm. Hopefully your house doesn't burn down. I'm saying it's not that the person's not fascinated by fire because they're constantly thinking, what's going to happen if I'm in a situation where, God forbid, I get burnt by fire. Chas v'shalom. But it's the power of the fire, the ability the fire has to cause destruction and also to cause light. The power of the fire is something that fascinates people. Or something that things that could fall. So he's describing all kinds of things that inspire fear as a concept into people, or inspire awesomeness. Right? When you go see a mountain, it's not because if you're anyone who's gone to see a large mountain. Where I come from in Seattle, there's a large mountain, Mount Rainier. So if you go to there's a lookout where you stand there and you look at the mountain, but you're from a very high space. It's not because you see greatness. You see a mountain, it's something great. So he's saying these are the things that a person should try to think about. It's not that you're scared that God's going to punish you or something. The fear of God should be of the awesomeness of God. V'im kain. So he says, elu heim shluchim ketanim. These are just small things of God's creation. As great as a lion is or a bear is, or an anos, a person who's a tyrant, or fire, or something that or falling buildings, or falling these are all just small things of God's creation. If awesomeness exists, it exists because it was created. Everything's a manifestation of Hashem, positive or negative, but everything has a source, and it all comes from God. So if there's awesomeness in creation, then awesomeness should be then you have to look at the source of awesomeness, and that is Hashem. And therefore you have to have fear of God of His greatness, not because God is not because you're scared of punishment. But a person should say to themselves, as a way to motivate themselves to have fear of Hashem is how would I do something? How could I sin? And he says, Nivza, how could I behave like a low person to such a great master like Hashem? These are all, again, this is the Alter Rebbe describes one after the next in chapter 41. Ilu haya ari v'doiv yachleu v'yakadosh baruch hu soiver albain. Here he says even another thing. He says the lion, if you're not protected from the lion or the bear, they'll hurt you. And God, even though He's so much greater than His creations, He still tolerates you. He tolerates us, and he can do whatever He wants. He's greater than a lion or a bear or anything else that could. So why don't we analyze, the Ramak says, the greatness, the awesomeness of God, and put that together with God's tolerance for us? And how should that not inspire a person to say, why would I want to do anything? With God, if He really wanted to, He could do whatever He wants. But He tolerates me, He listens to me, He talks to me, He hears me out, He provides for me. How doesn't this inspire fear of Hashem? So that's step number one. It says, are you not going to have fear of God? On analyzing, thinking about this, we know that a great part of service of Hashem comes from His bonenut. Service of Hashem is not just, of course, one has to perform the mitzvahs, do the mitzvahs, but a lot of the Kabbalah and Chassidut and Musar is focused on His bonenut. His bonenut means to contemplate. You don't just do things; you think about things. It means we say Nasa v'Nishma. It's not about, we say Nasa v'Nishma, we say that we're going to do, we said it, but this week's parsha, we're going to do, and then we're going to listen. But we have to listen also. We do because God told us to do. But we use our bonenut, our powers, our intellect to think and to contemplate what it is that Hashem, what about the greatness of Hashem, and this should inspire in a person. And step number one, fear. He says, Vasheni, the second idea is, when a person recognizes that Hashem is always watching, this is what it says in Tanya, chapter 41 again, when a person realizes that wherever you are, someone's watching you. You know, the famous story, I think, was Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, says the story of the person who says, you know, I want to pick apples from this guy's orchard. Stand by the gate and shout out to me if anyone comes by, so that you know that I don't get caught. So he says, all of a sudden the person starts shouting and says, who's coming? He says, God's watching. So here he says, when a person realizes God's watchful eye and is watching you constantly, if a servant is not always fearful of his or her master but being in front of them, you're constantly in front of God. And the person thinks about it, God is constantly in front of me. You know, what did Adam and Eve try to do? They try to hide. There's no hiding from God. And He's watching everything. So that should inspire fear in a person. Why would I not fulfill the commandments of Hashem? The third thing, he says, and when a person recognizes that the source of your soul and the source of everyone's soul is rooted in the attributes of God. There's some people that their soul is rooted in the attribute of kindness. And there's some people who their soul is rooted in the attribute of severity, gvura, boundaries. Not that you're supposed to be extreme, because everything in Torah has to have a skadlus, has to have coexistence. But what is the root of your soul comes from a different attribute. Some people are Sunday people, right? Sunday is the day of kindness. Monday is the day of severity. Tuesday is the day of 2 times blessing, of tiferes, of beauty. So each person's soul is rooted in another one of God's attributes. So when you're rooted in God's attributes, it doesn't just mean that you're inspired by God's attributes, or that you've come from God, your soul comes from God's attributes, but now is disconnected, and therefore your life is separate. When your soul is rooted in an attribute, it's still rooted in that attribute. So when a person is rooted in a certain attribute and brings blemish, so to say, and dirt to themselves, their actions, positive or negative, affect all the way back to the source. So if you're rooted in God's attribute of kindness and you don't behave kind to someone, you're so to say damaging the attribute of kindness. If you're rooted in boundaries or severity and you don't behave according to that, you're damaging the root of your existence, which is the attribute of God's severity. So he's saying the third thing that should inspire a person to have fear of God is to know that not the first thing is the greatness of God. So that's more abstract. The second thing is God's watching you. So it's less abstract, but it's still God watching you. The third thing is you're connected to God. What you do affects God because you come from God's attributes. And therefore, even if you may feel like you're, what do you want from me? Let me do what I want. So you may feel that way. No one's going to stop you. It doesn't change the fact that you're rooted in a person has a godly soul. And when you behave in a certain way and you do certain things, it affects positive or negative to your root, to your source. Therefore, he says, when you do a sin, you damage, you blemish the chamber of your attribute. Why would that not inspire fear to a person? Why should I be the cause of making dirty the chamber, the attribute of my source because of me? Who made this mess? You walk home, you come home, you see who made this mess. So, own up. That's the third thing. The fourth thing he says, Harvi yira shepgam maisav heimdoichem shchina lemaila. And he says the third thing is not just that your root, where you come from, your root source that you come from, gets affected positive or negative by your behavior. It says you're pushing God, you're separating the purpose of creation. God created the world for people to do Torah mitzvahs, perform Torah mitzvahs, to bring godliness down to the world. And by doing things that are not godly or contrary to godliness, you're pushing godliness away. It says, we learn in the Medrash says that when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, God moved up one space, moved out of the world, went to a higher space. And the next generation did more sins, and God moved further away. Right? And the third sins moved further away. And then Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, our forefathers, and Moshe and Aaron, until Moshe Rabbeinu gave the Torah, like we have in this week's parsha, and specifically when he built the tabernacle, the Jews built the tabernacle. God came back home. Basi Lagani, I came back to my garden. So when we do sins, we're pushing God away. So he said, when you do things, it's pushing godliness further up. The year a person should have fear. Why should I be the cause of this? Why am I separating the king from the queen? He says, and when a person doesn't want to separate Kucha Bricho HaKadosh Baruch Hu from the Shechina, means that when we say that there's a healthy relationship of what's known as the king and queen within godliness, which is the purpose of creation and the way the world is in its existence, when we don't do things right, so we're damaging the purpose of a creationship of the creation, and that's damaging what's called the relationship within Hashem between the king and the queen, between Kadosh Baruch Hu and the Shechina. By Yirashi Kayetzibs, and then when a person has these kind of fears, Adam, it puts a person in a straight line. Altikin Hamida Hazois, to have proper Yiras Hashem, Udavik ban, you're cleaving to godliness. So we're going to stop. We're going to do a short class today. We're going to stop here. because the next subject is of the class goes into a more lengthy one that I want to learn in one piece. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we will finish the class, finish the attribute, and then basically finish the Tomar Devorah in the next class or two. Laila Tov, everyone, and have a good Shabbos. Take care. Thank you, Ariel, for gathering the troops. Laila Tov.